Okay, welcome to part two of Module 11. This is Section B, where we're going to talk about animal rights. And we just finished up with the first module on virtue ethics and the ethics of virtue and being virtuous. And in between the the video I finished this morning for Module A, having my lunch, I sort of scoured through my emails and I get an email from Think Big, which is a subscription that I have. Lots of really cool ideas. And sure enough, the question was, are humans inherently evil? So I posted it. Do have a look at it. It's about a 5-minute video, very informative. But the language that is used and the ideas that are discussed should be very, very familiar because they have to do with social contract, with the notion of people being inherently one way or the other, or innately one way or the other, evil or good. Very relevant information and also relevant to what we're talking about today. Because the other thing about this particular module is, although we were talking about animal rights and animal welfare, which are two different things, it's interesting to watch how the argument is developed and how it's constructed. On the one hand, by Peter Singer, who is very much an advocate for animal rights, and then Tibor Machan, Tibor Machan, I think is the way it's pronounced, says, well, animals don't have rights, but we have to think about our behavior. So what is interesting is on the surface, they appear to be sort of on polar opposites of the issue of animal rights, but they end up in the same spot because they end up talking about people being virtuous, people being, well, behaving well, or at least behaving with some kind of benevolence towards animals. So we'll take a look at the argument and how it's constructed. And by doing that, be able to turn around and understand how an argument can be constructed, but how different means can still achieve the same end. So, excuse me. We'll start first of all with Peter Singer. That should be a name fairly familiar to you because we talked about Peter Singer and his notion of applied ethics. He was the gentleman that believes that we must, not ought or perhaps, we must donate all of our surplus wealth to charity, worldwide, local. He doesn't care. Just donate that money because it is your moral responsibility. You must do this. So Peter Singer then turns around and extends the same approach to helping humans to non-humans. And essentially that is his argument. He says all beings, human and non-human, are equal. So we're going to take a look at the validity, right, of Singer's premises in terms of how he constructs his argument and see whether he comes up with something that is at least worth considering. Right, the notion of animal rights. One of the issues that is raised in animal rights is the notion that animals have rights that are like humans. Now, that's something that Tibor Machan will talk about, and we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But let's look first of all at Singer's argument and how he structures it, and he does it kind of on a comparative or in a comparative way, because he talks about gender, he talks about race, and he talks about intelligence as sort of qualifiers for us extending our equal treatment to beings as well as non-human beings. So the first thing he talks about is gender equality. And here we're saying, look, or Singer is, and I'm repeating his words, the fact that Singer is saying, we extend equal rights to all sexes, men, women, others. And here we are trying to look at the notion of equality that is working in one part of society. And it is, now, we still have a long way to go, depending on who we are. That notion of equality is highly problematic. But let's say in an ideal world, Peter Singer says that gender equality is certainly valid because equality between men and women cannot be validly extended, or should be validly extended to non-humans. And the reason is why? Because men and women are similar beings and should be given similar rights, while non-human beings are different kinds of beings and should not be given equal rights. Well, the issue here is Singer's going, okay, well, that's not necessarily the case. Human and non-human is no different than man and woman. And that's kind of the way he argues it. Said, okay, well, we extend it to others, why not? If equality is the same for everyone under the law, why do we stop at human? We went from men now to women. Let's keep going. Let's go to non-human. So Singer believes that this difference should not stop us from extending the basic principles of equality to non-humans, just for the reason I've described. That why do we stop at human? We've now included men and women. Why do we stop there? Let's keep on going. So he is also careful to explain what he means by equality. And that is equal consideration for different beings, right? So different treatments, different rights. And it's not a value judgment, because the notion of equality, of course, everything is on a level plane. That rights for one group of people extends to the other, but extends equally. In other words, there is equal consideration no matter who you are. So if that's the case, Singer says, well, why do we stop at simply the human beings? Why not non-human beings? And so that's how he's able to say, look, if it works for one, it should work for the other. Then he moves on to from sex to race, right? And this is now an issue of visible minorities. And we've said, okay, we extended it first of all to women. We've extended equal rights and considerations to members of all races. So no one today can deny equal rights to women or minorities on moral grounds. It just isn't there anymore, thankfully. So Peter Singer uses this way of arguing and says, okay, we've gone this far. We've extended it to gender. We've extended it to race. And if that is the case, once again, why do we have to stop there? Let's go all the way. And so he says, look, we would be on shaky ground, right, if we were to demand equality for blacks, women, and other groups of humans, while denying equal consideration to non-humans. So he says there's no reason why we have to stop at this arbitrary point. It is literally an arbitrary point, much like it was 100 so years ago. Actually, depending where you live, about 100 years ago, the right to vote was not extended to women. It just wasn't. And we talked about this last week when we spoke about Carol Gilligan and differences between men and women. Those differences were used to discriminate. And Singer is saying, no, they may be non-human, but we should treat them equally. And it's immoral and unethical to simply arbitrarily stop at sex and race. So he continues. He goes on, all right, we've now dealt with the issue of gender, the issue of sex, and now he looks at intelligence. And he says, look, the way that people are born should not be a way to define or discriminate. There we are again. It used to be except for women, but it's not. And so he says, look, physical and mental differences should not be the way in which we define and assign rights. So under the law, we are equally subject to the law, yes, but we are also allegedly equal under the law, equal consideration. So he says, yes, based on gender, based on race, and now based on intelligence. Now, you could also include in intelligence physiological changes. So, because he says physical and intellectual differences are not distributed equally, so it should not be used to turn around and to arbitrarily discriminate over certain people because they are weak, because they're mentally feeble, or whatever the issue was. It used to be this way. It used to be much worse. But again, we make up these kind of arbitrary borders or boundaries around certain things. And Singer says, no, if we're not going to use gender, sex, or intelligence and or physiological differences to distribute this equality, this notion of equality, then again, why do we arbitrarily stop there? So ultimately, he says, equality is a moral idea, right? It's not asserted as a fact. It needs to be created. It needs to be maintained. We talked about the social contract a couple of weeks ago and how the notion of equality and being subject to the same under the law is really the same thing. And Singer says, okay, an animal may not understand the social contract, but clearly they can understand other things. They can certainly feel pain. They can also feel love. Nothing like scratching a cat's belly and they start purring. that's probably a good indication that they're happy. They're happy there. So we can tell, right? We can connect with them. So Singer says, look, intelligence and physical attributes are not the way by which we are going to define whether or not someone is treated equally. And if that's the case, he says, okay, here's my main point. The principle of the equality of human beings is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. It is a prescription of how we should treat human beings. And the word prescription here is like going to the drugstore. Prescriptive behavior is expected behavior, behavior that we should follow. When the doctor writes out a prescription, it says 2 tablets every morning, he's telling you what to do. That's what prescriptive behavior is. We're being told what to do. In other words, we enter into a social contract. We then abide by that contract and abide by the laws that are generated from this contract, not to harm one another, to be honest to one another, to trust one another. And he says, okay, if it is a social construct, that construct should be robust enough to include non-human beings. And essentially that is his argument. So these differences that he's talked about, gender, sex, and physical and intellectual changes and differences, we have been able to deal with these. And so the interest of some human beings, take into account all human and non-human beings, those differences we have been able to deal with. The social contract has been flexible enough to include all individuals based on race, all individuals based on the sex that they're born into, and also their intelligence. So people who are less intelligent than others are not treated in some sort of inferior way or locked up in some way. But if we were to do that, we would of course be racist, right? Or we would be sexist, because we are discriminating against a person based on the color of their skin or who they are in terms of their, and again, I keep saying their sex. Gender for me is a social construct. Sex is physiologically who you're born as. So if you are being sexist, you're discriminating against someone because they're not the same sex as you. So Singer points this out and says, okay, we need to extend this all the way, because if we don't, we are also going to be performing another kind of ism, which is speciesism. And speciesism is discrimination against non-human beings. So in the same ways we discriminate against people of color, against women, against the trans population, for example, we're doing the same thing to animals if we are conducting or believing in speciesism, that somehow we are above animals, that we are entirely, right in using them, as basically beasts of burden, to kill them and eat them and so on. If we don't treat them with respect, we are guilty of speciesism. So if possessing a higher intellect stops us from exploiting others, how or why does it entitle us to exploit non-human beings? So no matter which position you take, whether it's gender, race, or intelligence, or physiological differences, if we can overlook those, Singer says, surely we can overlook differences between human and non-human. So equal consideration of interests is an idea that's been around for quite some time. No surprise, but it actually starts with Jeremy Bentham, the famous utilitarian, who in his sort of overview of society at large, not only talked about prison reform, but he also talked about animal welfare. So as far back as, say, the 1750s, 1770s, the issue was already there. And the notion of looking at animals not as beasts of burden, but also as not just merely non-human beings, animals, creatures with feelings, and with certain rights. That do we really have the right to harm these animals? Because Bentham asks a very simple question, right? The question is not, can they reason or can they talk? Clearly they cannot, or at least they cannot speak in a language we understand. But can they suffer? Right? We have that we have that with animals. We share that with them. So a capacity for suffering or enjoyment of happiness is not just a characteristic like a capacity for language. Capacity for suffering and enjoyment is a prerequisite for having interest at all. right? A condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interest in a meaningful way. So we are now in a position where we are looking at non-human beings as similar enough to us. And there's a qualifier. They are not utterly different. This is not apples and oranges are both fruit. We're talking, chalk and cheese. No, we're not. We're back to the apples and oranges kind of thing, right? We are beings. And Singer says, if we are all beings who can suffer, who can be happy, surely is that not enough for us to extend these rights to animals? So it is an issue of looking at what types of beings we are discussing. And for Singer, he says, look, no matter the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that its suffering be counted equally with the suffering of other beings. We don't know whether animals, can suffer from a broken heart, but if you can imagine the sound of an animal caught in a bear trap, that should be enough for you to think about the fact that animals can clearly suffer. There's no question that they do. And the fact that we can connect with that, we can see and hear and, yes, feel that pain, for Singer, that's enough, right? That's enough to connect us with them on a higher level than simply looking at them going, well, yeah, they're a beast of burden. That's all they really are. So we need to be very careful when we think about animals in that particular way. We know that animals can feel pain. And that's why, because they can suffer, that we don't have the moral right to harm them. We don't have the moral right to carve them up or to attach them to a machine and have them walk for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, moving, a grist mill like they used to in the 1800s. It's maybe a different kind of suffering, but it still is a suffering nonetheless. And so he ends his argument rather provocatively when he says, look, although comparisons of suffering between members of different species cannot be made precisely, we cannot measure the degree to which an animal suffers, we can maybe with us, species cannot be, and because we experiment on non-human animals due to their helplessness and intellectual inferiority, are we also, based on this premise, prepared to allow experiments on human infants or the mentally challenged? Which is provocative, because that's where he's able to go back to the argument saying, remember, you agree to gender? Yes, of course, men and women. Agree to race? Of course, all people, doesn't matter who they are. It's visible minorities or whoever. Intelligence? Well, of course, we're being unfair. Then why do we experiment on animals? And because they are helpless and cannot speak out, and they are intellectually inferior, allegedly, to us, although I believe dolphins are supposedly much smarter than we are. If that's the case, if that's how we categorize them as being somehow subhuman or sub-beings, then by that logic, we should be experimenting on the mentally challenged, right? And in human infants, because they too are helpless. They too are intellectually inferior. So it is a very provocative way to end his argument, but is one that is also highly effective because it makes us think twice about, yes, okay, he did say animals suffer, and that should be enough for us to reconsider what we're doing to them. So that, in essence, is Singer's argument. He's able to create and construct an argument based on premises that we also can recognize and agree to. First of all, the notion of gender equality, racial equality, and an equality to human beings, regardless of their mental capacities or the physical capacities. And he says, yeah, that distinction is arbitrary. And we should go all the way and include non-human beings. Because if we are going to allow those distinctions to be overridden by the notion of equal treatment, again, why do we stop arbitrarily where we now are about to move into non-human beings? So that's the gist of his argument. So now what I'd like to do is, in the second part, is look at Tibor Machan's argument about animal rights. And what Tibor Machan is arguing is that animal rights, or animals don't have rights. But let's look exactly at what it is that he means. Okay, he argues that animals have no rights because they are incapable of moral goodness. And what he means by that is that all the issues that we've talked about in this course regarding, what one ought to do, right? Whether we're talking about ethical egoism, whether we're talking about utilitarianism, all of these isms and all these moral positions have to do with choice, right? They have to do with taking responsibility for one's choices as well. So McCann says, look, animals have no rights because they're incapable of moral goodness. They're incapable of weighing good and bad or right from wrong and making a clear decision on, of course, the side of right. So if that's the case, McCann thinks that no, animal or rights as we know them, that are extended, of course, to humans, just don't apply to animals because they're not the same, right? Rights and liberties are political concepts, they're social concepts, they're moral concepts, and they are really applicable to us, human beings. And we have moral agency. We can realize an idea, right? We can bring an idea into action and into play and act on it. And animals just are animals. They're more instinctual. So that's kind of the main focus of his argument, is that animals are incapable of moral goodness. So if it is true that the moral nature of human beings gives rise to the concept of basic rights and liberties, then the animal rights argument is flawed for that reason, because animals don't have rights in the way that we articulate those to us, right? That are political and legal and social and moral. Animals just don't recognize these things. So for us, right, to have rights and obligations means having those around us abstain from, harming us, using us as a means to an end, lying to us, all these things that we wish to have done to us because we are doing our best to behave this way, right? Do unto others as they would have them do unto you. And this kind of thing, just for McCann, just doesn't apply to the animal kingdom. We have governments, right, that secure that happiness and enjoyment that John Locke spends lots of time talking about, and Rousseau, of course. But governments don't exist in the animal kingdom. There is no sort of overriding government, although, there is the Lion King, and we look at them because we apply a metaphor from our world to theirs and say, well, he's kind of like the king of the jungle. Okay, all right, it works for us. Now, is this lion an actual king? Do they have a kingdom? Probably not. But we understand the figure, the characteristics of being a king. But in a specific moral and ethical way, no, the animal kingdom, according to McCann, doesn't have these particular configurations. No legal, social, moral, ethical, or governmental structures. So in terms of rights that are attributed to these institutions and these structures, just don't exist. So modern philosophers have attempted to show that if we can ascribe basic rights to humans, then we should be able to do the same to non-humans for two reasons. We are different kinds of beings, right? Human and non-human. Similarities between human and non-human animals matter, but not their difference. So similarities in terms of our suffering, right? We talked about that with Singer. Is that enough to warrant extending those rights to animals? And of course, McCann says, well, no, because it's not solid grounding. So when we look at the way people behave, now we're going to start moving towards this idea of, behaving virtuously. And here is a difference between morality as a value system that does inform our behavior and ethics, which is the expression of that value system. And here's where we start seeing it work, and we start seeing McCann's argument shift a little bit, because he's still talking about animal rights, but what he ends up doing is shifting the emphasis away from animals and back to us. And so this is what he's about to do here. So he says, look, reckless disregard for the life and well-being of animals typically shows a kind of moral defect of character, a lack of sensitivity, a sense of callousness, that people are inherently awful towards animals, and certain people are just lose it if they see that happening, and so they should, because you're harming or hurting a helpless animal, and it doesn't matter what animal there is. It's just that primordial, like you feel that suffering so fast, and so people who do this are not virtuous, right? They are not moral. They are unethical. And frankly, cruel. So that's where Macan starts to shift away from the animal per se to the behavior of the person. And so, although Singer and Macan have these sort of two different approaches to this topic, as we finish up, we'll see that we're kind of almost in the same position here. It's rather interesting. So Macan says, look, we are justified in the use of animals for human purposes because of one simple reason. We are more important than non-human animals. We're simply higher on the, I guess, on the scale of, closer to God, whatever you want to call it. Somehow we're at the very top of the food chain. But throw a lion and a person into a cage, I guarantee you I know who's going to be coming out of that cage alive, right? It won't be the two-legged guy, the two-legged person, I should say. So if that's the case, we are more important than non-human animals. Does that give us the justification to harm animals? So Macan is now sort of moving, focusing more on us. So he said, okay, yes, we're more important than non-human animals, but does that give us a green light, right? Does that give us some kind of, the ability to go and harm animals? Well, no, because we are the ones with the moral capacity. So other things invite evaluation without implying a moral standard with references to whether they do well or badly. We are moral animals. Non-human beings are not, but human beings are moral animals. And therein lies where the decision is going to be made. So some beings, human beings, that's us, right? We invite moral evaluation. Our behavior should be evaluated from a moral standpoint, an ethical standpoint. And we're the ones who have that moral or rational capacity to improve our lives. So again, in the same way that Singer was focusing on the animal and saying, well, non-human beings should have animal rights, here the shift is, although Macan doesn't say it straight up, he's advocating for animal welfare. Right? Animal welfare is the well-being of animals, taking care of animals, not being excessively cruel to animals, versus Peter Singer, who is really pretty strident about animal rights. So although both are about animal rights, there is a shift in behavior, shift in emphasis between Singer's view of the animal and Macan's view of people and their relationships to animals. So we have animal rights on one side, which is Singer, and animal welfare, which is on the other side, which is Macan. So that is important to remember. So yes, we may be members of a different species. We're Homo sapiens. We are not, gorillas or fish or anything else like that. We are Homo sapien, right? So we are different species. We're still beings, right? We're beings that suffer and die. We have a moral and ethical life, and that is what makes us different from non-human beings. So it's not discounted as a matter of saying, well, we shouldn't worry about them. No, the emphasis now gets placed back on us. We're the ones who live a moral and ethical life, not animals. So it doesn't discount or dismiss the behavior that we have towards those animals. It shifts the emphasis. It shifts it back to us, right? Because if animals don't have moral rights, okay, that's one. They don't understand morality the same way we do. They don't recognize it, don't see it, they don't have it, but we do. We are the ones who have it. So there's no valid argument for rights in a non-human world, which is true, according to Macan, which is the world where moral responsibility is absent. It doesn't exist. But that does not mean that we turn around and behave in a horrible way. And finally, Macan concludes his argument by saying that non-human beings do not have the basic rights to life, liberty, and property, which is something that is innately part of the human kingdom, not the animal kingdom. But we're not off the hook yet, right? Yes, Macan says animals feel pain, animals do suffer. And because we know that, that's where the morality comes in. Because we need to start making choices in the way that we ought to behave in a certain way with other individuals. Macan says, okay, I'll grant you that, but I will also grant you that that should extend to non-human beings. So he says, okay, the morality comes in when basic choices are being made. Animals cannot make those choices, but we can and we should. So the question now becomes, how should I live my life? How should I treat animals? And as you can see, this middle picture here, which is absolutely wonderful. Trust me, every time I hear about an elephant, for example, that kills a big game hunter, I cheer. I'm so happy that happens, because big game hunting is the most sickening thing I can think of. I cannot think of anything more classist and just horrible. It's just a horrible thing. So every time I hear of a big game hunter that is done in by another animal, I just can't cheer loud enough. I love that, because not only is it karma, but it's what they deserve. That's what those hunters deserve. Because the next time they want to go hunt an animal, get rid of the Jeep, get rid of the high-powered rifle, get rid of the telescopic sight. Just go in there and just hunt them, with your bare hands. That I'll definitely watch. Anyway, I digress. But McCann does say, yes, he sticks to his argument that animals do not have basic rights as we understand them in terms of life, liberty, and property, which is the way that John Locke would describe it. But on the other hand, our behavior towards animals, the welfare of the animal, is our concern. So we don't abdicate that. We embrace it and we acknowledge it and we think about it, and that's where we make our choices. How should I live my life? Do I go out of my way to harm animals or to help them? Or if I don't harm them, I don't do anything else, but I leave them alone, right? So it's really interesting how those two arguments really essentially end up in the same spot. The rights of animals are, or at least the suffering of animals is considered, but it's approached from two different ways. Singer focuses almost exclusively on the animal and says we need to extend it to them. And McCann says, no, let's take it the other way. Yes, animals may not have rights in the way that we describe them in morality, but we do. We're the ones with the moral compass, and we should know better. Okay, so that's really the argument. As I said, Singer uses these three ideas of gender equality, race, and intelligence, and says we've extended these, or we've extended equal treatment to all individuals, regardless of these characteristics. So why can't we extend it to non-humans? If we are going to act in a horrible way and be racist and sexist against other individuals, if we do that to non-human beings, we're guilty of speciesism. And that's a word I must admit I'd never heard before until I began reading this material. But speciesism is exactly that, us discriminating against non-human beings. And finally, I believe the last one here, key points about the nature of morality. This is sort of a very quick overview of McCann's point. There's no moral justification for us regarding that pain and pleasure of animals is no less important. Okay, there's where there's overlap between Singer and McCann, so they do agree on that, but it's what they do with it. McCann turns it back on us and says, no, we are the ones that make the choices, not the animals. The animals just live instinctively, right, or instinctually. We don't. We have a higher calling, and we have choices to make. That's essentially it. That's the lesson in animal welfare versus animal rights, and it fits in with Aristotle's virtue ethics in the way that we choose to sit in the center. We're not going to go and be afraid of animals, nor are we going to go out of our way to harm them, but we're going to be in the middle. We're going to think about our behavior, and maybe we can minimize the degree of suffering that we inflict on other animals, and maybe think twice about what we eat. Maybe think more seriously about a plant-based diet. Harvey's, right? Not that I'm trying to sound like a commercial here, but Harvey's has been selling plant-based burgers for several years, and I think they're delicious. They're great. They really don't taste any different. I have no problem with that. Animal testing, right? Animal testing on cosmetics, mascara, and so on. For individuals to think twice about endorsing doing that. Intentional cruelty to animals. First of all, what the hell is in mascara that would cause an animal to die, right? I wouldn't, if I were, wearing mascara, I wouldn't want to be putting that stuff on. So those are the things that we can think about when we reformulate our relationship to animals. Do we endorse unnecessary cruelty to animals? And so if we do, then maybe we think twice about products that do exactly that. That the existence of product X or Y on the cosmetic shelf is a result of an animal being harmed or in fact dying. So we need to, make those distinctions. Or, do we, when we go to the market on the weekend, if we can afford, because let's face it, organic food and, grain fed and farm fed or farm raised animals, surprise, they're always more expensive, but that's a choice we make, right? That's a choice we can make. Am I going to buy into the farm factories that pump out, animals from in one door alive, out the other door, packaged and ready to be sent to our tables or to grocery stores? Do we endorse a farmer that treats his or her animals with some degree of respect? Or do we just go to the grocery store and we just buy, product X or Y simply because it's convenient? So all those things Makan is asking us to think about, because they are choices we can make. They are choices that we can make when we are thinking about our relationship to non-human beings. Because even if we don't even have a pet, a lot of the things that we do indirectly interact with the animal world. So Makan is asking us to rethink that. And for me, that falls more into animal welfare than it does to animal rights. Both are valid. So depending on how far you want to take it, at the very least, animal welfare asks us to reconsider our relationships with the animal kingdom, regardless of whether we're thinking of food or unnecessary cruelty to animals. So that's pretty well it. So we're going to meet again probably Wednesday or Thursday. These are the slides for this week. Hopefully, I think by now the quiz, the quiz will be done this coming Friday. So just a reminder, because it is the 23rd, the quiz will be done on the 27th. No, sorry, the 29th, my mistake. The quiz is still open, so please do make sure to complete it, and it will be closing Sunday, November 29th. So take care, and we will see you in a few days.